Welcome in to another edition of Inside Carolina's Next Level. It's been a while. We're sponsored by Johnny T-Shirt, JohnnyT-Shirt.com, and Congruity HR. I am Tommy Ashley. That is Greg Barnes. And you know when we have Greg Barnes on the show, it's got to either be about the NCAA, the Board of Trustees, realignment, all the deeper topics that we're not talking about balls and strikes or first down carries. Greg, I bring you here as the elder statesman for all things really relevant and important for Carolina. First of all, what's going on? How you been? And are you ready to talk about this mess that we are in the middle of? It seems like.
Yeah, Tommy, things are going well, and you're right. This has been bubbling under the surface for a long while now, and it seems like we've really kind of been working behind the scenes to kind of get an understanding of where everything stands, how we got here, where we're going for the past really 6 months or so. And clearly, there's a long way to go if you paid attention to some of the board meeting activities last week. But that's part of the process. We know that the grant of rights runs through 2035, 36. I think everybody understands, as Bubba Cunningham has pointed out in interviews with us, that who knows what the college landscape is going to look like 5 years from now, let alone 12 years from now when the grant of rights deal reaches its final days. So a lot going on, and it's interesting to cover because everybody has an opinion. And I will say this: I think people need to understand that everybody involved wants the best for North Carolina, and I mean, everybody. It's not like anybody's trying to sabotage North Carolina whatsoever. There are just different opinions on how to get there, and there's a lot of lack of clarity. Part of that's because of the ACC and how they've handled things. But everybody's trying to figure out what is the best path forward for UNC athletics, and we're right in the middle of that right now.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and you and I talk fairly often about this. It feels like we're at a monumental shift time, and Buck Sanders has written about it in his columns. Another reason for folks to be on Inside Carolina Premium stuff, not just the recruiting, but Buck's columns 3 times a week are worth the price of admission. But it feels like we are on the brink of something happening major. We've seen it with the Big Ten and the SEC. The moves they're making, the money. But Greg, let's go all the way back to 2000. We talked a little bit about this off air. Enlighten people how quickly this has changed. And when I say quickly, 24 years is, it seems like a long time, but in reality, it's not. But 24 years ago, where was the ACC in all this mess?
Well, I think everybody remembers the glory days of the ACC, and that's dating back to the 80s and 90s when college basketball was the ticket, right? And the ACC had a stranglehold on college basketball. And because of that, and because we're only talking about 9 teams at the time, everything was rosy for the ACC and the footprint. If you start looking at some of the data, the ACC paid out $8.1 million per school in the year 2000. That's the most of any conference in the country. The ACC was number one. If you fast forward to today, everybody knows that the ACC is lagging behind not only the SEC in the Big Ten right now, but the Big 12 has done a pretty good job kind of building their uh, building their packages, their media packages, and that's competitive. I mean, if you look at some of the projected numbers uh, for the next couple of years, anyway, the Big 12 is supposed to be paying out just a few more million than the ACC in terms of per school distributions. That's a problem. And even if you go back to 2010, we knew this shift had already happened because at that point in time, the ACC was paying out 12.3 million, which was already third behind the SEC and the Big Ten, about 10 million behind the Big Ten at that point in time. And so when we start looking at kind of the history of the ACC since 2000, there have been some mistakes made. And some of those have kind of led us to where we are now. If you go back to the first round of conference expansion for the ACC, What did John Swofford do? Well, Swofford thought, okay, we're the Atlantic Coast Conference. Let's dominate the Atlantic Coast. Makes sense, right? So you bring in Miami, you bring in Syracuse, you bring in Boston. And what's the thinking? Well, with Miami, you bring in South Florida market. Syracuse, you bring in the New York market. Boston College, well, you bring in the Boston market. These are massive TV markets. Unfortunately, in New York, it's a pro sports area. In Boston, it's a pro sports area. So a lot of those attempts at kind of generating more media share really didn't pan out. And then you add in the fact of the size of schools. I mean, if you look just right now, the average undergraduate enrollment for the Big Ten is almost 32,000 kids. The ACC undergraduate is 17.5. So just at a 1 year look in, that's significant. But when we start adding year upon year upon year and decade upon decade, that's your alumni base. That's your viewership. That's your media market. And so it made sense for the Big Ten to put in the Big Ten Network, and it's been an incredible success for them. Similarly with the SEC, of course, the SEC is not as big as the Big Ten, but they still have roughly 9,000 more per school undergraduates than the ACC does. So the SEC network was a boon. Well, John Swofford wanted an ACC network. And the ESPN, everything that we've been told is ESPN was a little bit unsure. And that's what Swofford wanted. That's what he wanted his legacy to be. So in 2016, when the ACC network was launched, part of the deal to get ESPN to buy into the ACC network concept was a 20-year media deal. And that's where we get to the grant of rights. I think at this point in time, we can say, okay, the idea of bringing in Syracuse and Boston College didn't pay off the way we thought. Similarly, signing the grant of rights for 20 years was not maybe the best idea. Good intentions, but didn't play out. Why? Well, the SEC and the Big Ten have just redone their media deals. I believe it, let's see, the Big Ten 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, really, signed an $8 billion media deal over 7 years. $8 billion.
Incredible.
Really is incredible. And that's with CBS, NBC, and Fox. Here's the thing. The Big Ten will renegotiate their contract before the ACC's grant of rights is up. The SEC is the same thing. So if you project forward just 10 years, if nothing changes, the SEC and the Big Ten will be bringing in even more money. And so that's where we get into the projections. And we've talked about this before, but I think it's relevant to the conversation right now, Tommy. Kevin Guskowitz, former chancellor of UNC, told me in December that all the data that he had suggested a annual revenue gap between SEC schools and the Big Ten schools and the ACC at 35 to 45 million per year. Navigate, which is a sports media firm that does a lot of these consults, they think it may be even worse. That they've projected it being 45 to 55 million. So these are massive revenue gaps, and everybody that likes Carolina athletics, whatever your sport of choice may be, when you're dealing with revenue gaps that significant, it puts you at a disadvantage. And so that's where we get to today's activities, where everybody's trying to figure out what the best path forward is. And at this point in time, there's not that unity and vision that's going to happen for UNC to really be able to make the right decision moving forward.
And that's the thing. Ultimately, it's all about the money, and it's all about the plan. And Greg, what I've said and what I've seen, and if folks want to go back and watch the Board of Trustees meetings and all the meetings that they have, you can certainly find everything on YouTube. It is fascinating to see, to your point, everybody ultimately wants the same thing, for Carolina to be on the cutting edge of whatever, whether it's research, which they're good there, or athletics. Everybody wants the best. Sometimes it doesn't come across that way simply because, Greg, and I ask you this, they don't appear to have any sort of unity or a unified approach to this. I know we read about Florida State and Clemson all the time, and I'm sure it's similar if you get into the weeds there. But your thoughts just on that before we get into this Board of Trustees meeting from the other day. Your thoughts on that unified front. And one thing, and I'll say this: Carolina has a top-notch journalism school, a top-notch school that highlights the ability to get on a unified front and present that publicly. But Carolina has struggled with that as a university massively, I think, over the years. Maybe that's unfair to say, but I believe it. Your thoughts here on what it's going to take to get there, to get a unified front, a unified approach. This is our plan. This is what we're going to do, because the public aspect of it that we can see publicly, it doesn't look like it's there yet. I'll say it that way.
Yeah, Tommy, and it's interesting if you go back 30 years, probably even further, but there's always kind of been bubbling beneath the surface is this football versus basketball mindset. And Mac Brown talked about that in his biography, and he talked about it when he came back to Carolina in 2018, at the end of 2018, about kind of how he was, not given the love that he felt he deserved. When it came time for him to have a contract renewal at the end of the 97 season, he asked to be paid what Bill Guthridge, who was the new head coach of the basketball team, Bill was making $1 million, and Mac was making about a third of that. And Mac wanted to be paid what Bill Guthridge was being paid in his first year as a head coach. And there was a lot of back and forth about whether or not he deserved that. And there were some hard feelings there. So there's been kind of that two sides approach for a long time, but it's always kind of been beneath the surface. And I only bring that up because now we're at a point in time with the way that the college football playoff has exploded. I mean, football is king bee now. I mean, there is no doubt about it, especially when you look at all the numbers and where the money can come in at. I mean, even for North Carolina, where the basketball program is arguably the best in the country, it still brings in and has less profit than the football program. And that's a big deal. Everybody needs to understand that as we talk about these things moving forward. But I think the reason that you started to see some cracks and some of this behind the scenes stuff started to become public in recent weeks and months and really came to a head, it seemed, at the Board of Trustees meeting, is, to your point, there hasn't been maybe that unity in how to proceed. If you paid attention to the Board of Trustees meeting, there's comments about, concerns were raised about how the budget was taking shape back in November, and how they continue to have questions about exactly where money is going in the athletics budget. And that's a lot of this is kind of behind the scenes, off the record type information. So we can't dive into the details. But what people need to know is when we say those things, it's not about cutting non-revenue sports. I have not had anybody say to me, hey, we need to cut these sports. That's not what it's about. It's about, okay, do we need to be pushing more money towards non-revenue sports, knowing that realignment is a conversation in the years to come? Or do we need to be setting ourselves up to be in the best position we can with our revenue sports should the time come that we can potentially move conferences? And a good example here, Tommy, if you go back to when Butch Davis came in back in 2007, there was a conversation, and he brought it up at the ACC kickoff in Pinehurst, where he starts talking about, we're doing all these stadium renovations. We're going to do what ultimately would become the Blue Zone. We're going to redo the press box across from the Pope box, all these things. Well, none of that was supposed to be public information. That was all conversation behind the scenes, and it really stressed Dick Bedore that got out. But that was Butch Davis saying, look, we are lagging behind in what we need for the football program to be able to compete nationally. At that point in time, when the NCAA came in 2010, one of the things that was the main takeaway was Carolina only had a couple people in the compliance office that were full-time. Alabama at that time had like 8 full-time. because they understood, kind of what was important in terms of infrastructure and staffing and all those kind of things. And Carolina was way behind that, especially on the football side of things. So it's been this process of trying to get the football program up to speed. Mac Brown has done a good job of that. And so this is still kind of part of that conversation of, all right, we want to make sure that all the money is being used effectively. And I think when you start talking about maybe differences of opinions, the best way to describe it is that there are some who think that North Carolina need to really be pushing the option of moving conferences, whether it be to the SEC or the Big Ten. And so that everything that transpires in the athletic department, especially with the budget, should be viewed through that lens of this is where we ultimately want to go. So let's set ourselves up for success, however many years down the road that may be. The other side understands that, everybody understands conference realignment. Everybody understands that Carolina may ultimately need to move in the years to come if the ACC doesn't do a better job of elevating revenues. They're more willing to say, okay, a little bit of we're going to continue business at hand. We understand that's a possibility, but we want to make sure that Carolina continues to be competitive in every single sport that we play, and not just focus everything on a potential move. And that's really where the division comes in. And that's where some of this popped up with the Board of Trustees meetings. Is there's conversation about, okay, what exactly are we doing with the budget? Are we utilizing it efficiently towards our potential goals? And is there money going to maybe some non-revenue sports that is probably not in the best interest of North Carolina athletics?
That's a lot to unpack there. Let me ask you if you know, or what your opinion is, and we haven't talked about this. When did football really become the queen bee sport in college athletics? Because I think for the ACC to realize that was far later than other schools and other conferences did. But in your opinion, when did that shift happen?
Well, yeah, the BCS started about the same time that Mac was leaving for Texas. The Bowl Alliance, I guess, is what it was called back then, and then it became the BCS. And as they started working through some of those packages, and the SEC really dedicated resources to football, and the Big Ten. Obviously, Big Ten's had a long history with football, but they continue to push it as well. It just became the viewing choice for the fans, and it really has exploded. And what has happened, baseball has kind of taken a step back, and college basketball has taken a step back. There were a number of years ago when they started moving the first Carolina Duke basketball game back to about when the Super Bowl started. And that was really a telltale sign, because that was an indication that they were like, okay, look, football's about over. This is our primetime highlight game of the year across college basketball. We need everybody to start thinking about college basketball now, so that you have a 2-month February and March window where everybody can latch on to college basketball. Whereas college football now, and NFL as well, has become such a year-round occasion that there's just a ton of money and a ton of interest there. It's just phenomenal when you look at, we don't have to dive into it, but look at how the NCAA tournament pays out. And I mean, that's where the bulk of the college basketball money comes from. That's why, even though I think it is a horrible idea, they're really pushing the idea of expanding the NCAA tournament. Why? Money. That's it. That's the only reason they would consider expanding it, but that's their honeypot. And so baseball and basketball have kind of dropped off a little bit, and football has just exploded really over the last 20, 25 years.
Yeah, it's amazing, and the money it brings in, and I don't. That's one part of the old school fan base slash power structure hasn't really grasped totally and completely. Even today, we're recording this May 23rd, 2024. I don't think people really fully understand that. They're starting to come around more and more. You see the divisions at Carolina specifically. We're talking with Greg Barnes here on the Inside Carolina Next Level show. Of course, Johnny T-shirt and Congruity are our sponsors. Greg, when you see Board of Trustees meetings, when they have, I don't want to say animosity, but there's some tinge to it when you're listening to these things going on. What are your thoughts? Just as somebody who has covered this for Inside Carolina and has been around it for a couple decades or more now. When you hear this going on, what is Greg Barnes thinking as he listens to that?
Well, to your point there, Tommy, having been around the Carolina community for a long time now, you get a pretty good understanding of how things operate behind the scenes. And so when you see stuff like this happen at a Board of Trustees meeting, what you see is that's frustration kind of slipping through the cracks. And that kind of tells you that there's a lot going on behind the scenes, and people are not maybe getting the answers they want. They're kind of butting their heads up against the wall because two sides don't really agree. And I think that's really what we saw. And let me say this: I understand, some in the media kind of see what happened, and they want to focus on the fallout of that, of how this does not look like a UNC Board of Trustees meeting. This is not how this should have gone, and just kind of the spectacle of it. You have to understand, for one, that other schools in the Triangle, NC State and Duke, their fan bases love to see any kind of disagreement at UNC. And so it's an interesting talking point. I think if you're a Carolina fan, you need to look kind of behind the surface chatter of maybe how the communication went, and really think and look at what is this about? Why are they arguing in this way that I don't agree with, right? And that's really the conversation. And I think it's important for people to understand that since that time, there has been more conversation, and there is more agreement in, hey, okay, we are going to sit down, we are going to hammer these things out. We need to make sure that we're not kind of putting off this image that maybe none of us want. And so that's kind of the good thing that's come of it, is that there has been more conversation. There's going to be more conversation about how best to address some of these differences. And that's important. That's kind of what you need to see. And so, Tommy, just to kind of fully answer your question, I see it. It's not, oh, wow, maybe that looked bad, as much as it was, okay, so people are really frustrated. What is this about? And that's how I chose to view it. And I think Carolina fans would be best served if they looked at it the same way.
Yeah, it's especially in this day with social media, and to your point, people wanting to get in on it, talk about it, find a way to rip it, and then stir up other fan bases or other things going on there. It's watch what they do, not necessarily what they say these days. We talk about that a ton in recruiting. So when I see it, and I'm sort of, we haven't really talked about these questions, but what'd you think of? I felt like Bubba Cunningham caught some strays there, and obviously he's the face of the athletic department. He is very measured. You used that word in your column earlier, I guess late last week on Inside Carolina. Just sort of talk about that aspect of this, and the power structure, but also you got the Board of Governors, you got the Board of Trustees, you got Bubba, and you got on down to the coaches and everything. Just sort of set the scene for us about what needs to happen here, if that's a fair question, as far as the unified front, and then plans moving forward, and where everybody is in that, and what they can actually do regarding that.
Yeah, there are so many different rods in the fire, Tom. It's kind of wild to follow. But you've got a portion of the UNC powers that be, including some on the Board of Trustees, who look at the numbers and say, I mean, the ACC's days are over. We need to be setting ourselves up for a potential move if and when that opportunity comes. If the ACC doesn't do a much better job bringing in revenue, then maybe we don't have a choice, and maybe we have to get out sooner than later. Bubba, on the other hand, has been around the block, and dealt with the NCAA for a long time and has a lot of those connections. And I think measured is the right word, Tommy, as you mentioned, because Bubba very much is of the mindset of, look, we're in the ACC now. So our job being in the ACC should be to do everything we can to help the ACC address some of these issues while we're a member of the ACC. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't consider all of our options, because that's what you're supposed to do as a UNC athletic director. You're looking out for the best interest in your athletic department. But Bubba's very much of the mindset of, we're in the ACC. We need to be a good partner. We need to be doing whatever we can to boost the revenue sharing, to even out the playing field as best we can. Bubba's also been very pointed in saying that, we haven't had the most money in a long time. As I pointed out earlier, Carolina was $10 million in the hole to some of these conferences 14 years ago. And yet Carolina has had massive success, especially across the non-revenue sports and basketball as well. So his point is, you don't have to have the most money to have success, which is true. But really where the difference in mindset comes is, if we're talking about $5 or $10 million in difference, that's much different than if we're talking about $40 million in difference. And that's really where the concern comes from. And then beyond kind of the Bubba side and this other group side, who's more kind of gung-ho about the potential of moving conferences, now you got the Board of Governors and the state legislature involved. And state legislature, both of the leaders of Senate and of the House have said, if at all possible, we would like for NC State and Carolina to be in this together. The BOG, has kind of stamped their foot the last couple of months and saying that, any decision about realignment has to come through us. Well, guess what? It had to go through them anyway. So that's more of a posturing thing than anything of substance. So, you just have all these different parties involved with different opinions. And I think more than anything, Tommy, at the school level is where everybody has to get on the same page, and everybody has to be willing to come to compromises about how best to proceed. And I want to make it clear, to my, and I granted, there's probably a few who want to stay in the ACC no matter what. But to my knowledge, everybody understands that what's in the best interest of UNC is what is needed. If that stay in the ACC because Jim Phillips gets his act together finally and elevates the revenue sharing plan, well then, maybe everybody be happy to stay in the ACC. There's been no indication at this point in time that's going to happen. So everybody understands that if things are not addressed at the ACC level to improve the situation, Carolina needs to be willing to move conferences if it gets to that. So everybody's kind of in agreement on that for the most part. It's just a matter, again, of figuring out what is our path forward, if there is a path forward. And of course, when you start talking about the grant of rights, there's all kinds of discussions about how ironclad that actually is.
So as we wrap this up, and again, this has been Next Level with Greg Barnes, telling us all the NCAA, UNC, ACC knowledge he has. I guess the ultimate question becomes, why does this all matter, Greg? And we're going to do later shows this summer because Lord knows things happen. There's no off season. There's never downtime here, so we'll update this show as the summer goes along and talk more about finances and realignment. But NIL, I think, has a huge. Correct me if I'm wrong. NIL has made this even more desperate than it ever was before, because if you have $40 million extra in your bank, that's $40 million you don't have to ask people for. That's $40 million you can use on facilities to hire people and all that. And then the rest is gravy. I mean, that's how I see it, is the importance and how NIL and all of this has really changed the landscape to make this at least seem more urgent to get done. Is that accurate?
That is 100% accurate, Tommy. And let me add this little tidbit in. before I fully answer your question. Uh, Another piece of the puzzle is the $2.8 billion House settlement with the NCAA. It's the antitrust lawsuit. That's the revenue sharing with previous athletes in the NCAA, and it also kind of sets the stage for more revenue sharing moving forward. Why did the NCAA settle for 2.8 million? Well, if they had waited till next year to settle, it jumped to 4.2 billion. Um, and if they did not settle and went to court, there were projections that if they lost, the payout could be $200 billion, which would bankrupt the NCAA, and that would blow up the whole game. So it's $2.8 billion is the settlement, and what the NCAA is going to do, they're going to pay it. So I think it's 277 million over the next 10 years, which is a crazy amount of money. But that's coming from revenue shares from the schools. And so we're still waiting to get the specific numbers. But I mean, you're basically talking, um, you know, I don't even know what that number is, but I mean, it's a massive amount coming out of the ACC because the Power Five conferences I think are paying maybe 40% of that total. So when you start doing the math, I don't have my calculator in front of me. It's a lot of money that each school is going to be having to pay annually. So that adds to the need for more money. So you have that coming in, several $1,000,000. And if I mentioned Butch Davis back in 07, what was the conversation at that point in time? It was about the arms race for facility upgrades. That's where Carolina needed this brand new facility for football. You needed the blue zone, and you needed a new press box, and all these kind of things. You needed the practice facility. All these things is because you couldn't pay players at the time. So where did you have a way for donors to contribute to help the program? Well, you did it through facility upgrades. Well, and then all of a sudden, the coaching staffs started to expand. Nick Saban's one of the first to do that, started hiring all these various people on staff. So it went from facility upgrades to now we're talking about salary boosts. And that was a big thing for North Carolina when Mac Brown came in. Is, hey, Mac was willing to take less money as a head coach, but he needed a lot more money going to his assistants and to his staff. So Carolina has increased that total dramatically over the recent years. So we went from facility upgrades to coaching salaries. Well, then what happens? NIL comes in. So when you add the House settlement to all this, now you've got donor money going to facility upgrades, to coaching salary pools, now to NIL. The settlement is going to be a albatross on the budget for the years to come. And what Mac has said and what Bubba has alluded to is that they're having to go to the same donors over and over and over again saying, hey, we need money for the new Smith Center renovation or for the new Smith Center arena potentially in the years to come. We need more money for coaching salaries. We need to pay coaches better because we have to keep up with the SEC and the Big Ten. Well, now we need money for NIL. Carolina had that big push in the last year raising money for football NIL, and they've done the same for basketball. So you're having to go to the same donors for all this money. It's just not sustainable. So what does the increased revenue do for the Big Ten and the SEC? Well, those schools, because they have all this additional revenue coming in, they don't need to go to their donors for facility upgrades. Tennessee, University of Tennessee is a good example. They have a massive line item in their budget for facilities. It's upwards of like $10 million. And that's because they're not having to go to their donors to pay for all these facility upgrades. They can just use it out of the revenue that they're getting from the SEC. The same goes with coaching salaries. So if you're able to say, hey, donors, we got facilities handled, we've got coaching salaries handled, what we really need from you is to make us competitive on the NIL market.
Get us a left tackle.
Get us a left tackle. And that is the conversation. And so people are saying, well, you can't pay players, You're from the school. No, but the rules are changing. And so what can happen is that you can tell donors to push their money into collectives, so that instead of having, $2 million in the purse, you may have 10 million. And people need to understand. I know, especially the old timers, they hate NIL. They hate the idea of paying players. The way that we talk about NIL is going to change rapidly. And what I mean by that is we may not even refer to it as NIL a couple years down the road. It's going to be something different, and they're going to package this, maybe as scholarships and other things as the NCAA allows. So that's not about paying players; it's about supporting players, and that's going to be the lingo a couple years from now. That's how you kind of bridge the gap with NIL, with some of the big money guys that are a little bit older who don't like the concept. That's where we're going. And that is the benefit of having the additional revenue. As Bubba has said, you don't have to have the most money to be successful, but you need a lot of money to be competitive. And if your goal is to be competitive in where college athletics is going, which is where football is top of the mountain, your football program has to be competitive. That's where you have to have a lot more money flowing for infrastructure, for staff support, for facilities, for all these things. And that's the crux of the conversation right now, Tommy.
It is. I started it, and I'm gonna end it. It's all about the money ultimately, and how Carolina gets a piece of that. How Carolina moves forward in this new landscape. Greg, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, my friend. You're so knowledgeable on it. I feel like my IQ goes up after we do these shows and after I read your stuff. And we're going to circle back because, like you said earlier, it's rapidly changing. And if you're listening to this on Wednesday or Thursday or Friday on Inside Carolina, it might have already changed. So stay tuned to Inside Carolina. Stay tuned to Greg Barnes for the latest updates and all the Inside Carolina team. And also visit Johnny T-Shirt and visit congruityhr.com/Tar Heels for your small to mid-sized business needs. 2 local businesses. We talk about Chapel Hill, support local businesses with them. Greg, I appreciate it. I look forward to the next time we get together.
Yep, sounds good. Thanks, Tommy.